The paper plate sat on a folding tray outside my bedroom door. Cold turkey, canned cranberry, no silverware. It was Thanksgiving, and I wasn't invited to the table. I could hear their laughter down the hallway, plates clinking, my granddaughter's voice rising in delight. Then Jenna said it, plain, clear, like she was reading a grocery list. She's just a burden now. That word, burden, settled heavier than my bones ever had. I stared at the plate, and I knew I wouldn't be hers anymore. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Comment below. The house still smells like lemon oil and lavender, though I haven't cleaned with either in months. My hands, once strong from years of mopping floors and wringing out dishcloths, now ache just opening the peanut butter jar. I used to polish every corner of this home, our home, until it gleamed like pride itself. Now the corners collect dust. Jenna says it's just age, but I know the difference between dust and dismissal. We bought this place in 1972, Harold and I. He had a square jaw and a soft laugh, and he always insisted I pick the curtains, even if he didn't understand why they mattered. Whatever makes it feel like yours, he'd say. And I'd laugh, because it already did. The porch was his project. He built it every Saturday with hands that blistered from the factory. The garden was mine. We'd drink sweet tea and listen to cicadas in late July, our knees touching. It wasn't a mansion, but every corner held something sacred. Then came the kids. Jenna was the middle one, all fire and precision. She'd line up her crayons by shade and fold her socks before she could spell laundry. I raised her on home-cooked meals and bedtime stories. Every night, I'd rub her back in little circles until she fell asleep, whispering prayers she doesn't remember now. Life moved like it does, too fast, too loud, and then suddenly quiet. Harold passed 15 winters ago. Heart stopped in his sleep. One moment he was snoring beside me, and the next, the room felt too big. After the funeral, Jenna said I should consider selling the house, downsize a bit. But I couldn't. It held too much of him, of us. So I stayed. Jenna came back 6 years ago. Her marriage had crumbled. Something about money, or cheating, or both. I never asked. When she moved in, she said it was just until she got back on her feet. I said yes, of course I did. Mothers don't ask for guarantees, they open doors. At first, it felt like family again. She'd bring me tea, fold the laundry, even sat with me during Sunday morning church on the radio. Her daughter, Madison, was still small then, loved my pancakes, always climbed into bed with me during storms. But seasons changed, quietly, furniture disappeared. Too bulky, she said. Family photos went into boxes. She said they made Madison sad, seeing Papa everywhere. Even my bedroom changed. My rocking chair was taken to the garage to make space. I didn't argue. I told myself it was just adjustment. Then came the mail going missing. Bills I never saw. Medicare letters she handled. My pills moved to higher shelves. "Don't worry, Mom," she'd say, all smiles. "I've got it under control." I should have felt comforted, but something inside me, the old, quiet part, began to whisper. They'd go out often, the two of them, to dinner or the movies. Sometimes I'd wait up, just to say goodnight. But they'd slip in late, shoes off, lights low. No one knocked on my door. I began to feel like a guest in the house I once scrubbed on hands and knees. Still, I tried. I baked her favorite pie for her birthday, pecan, golden brown. She didn't eat it, said she was cutting sugar. I waited at the window for them to come home that night with balloons or laughter. They came in with takeout boxes instead. Madison never asked for a slice. I stitched a quilt for Madison last Christmas. It took 3 months, every square from old dresses she'd worn as a child. She unwrapped it, smiled politely, and set it aside for the new iPad. I told myself it didn't matter, but something inside had begun to sag. Not just my shoulders, but my place in this world. I still get my Social Security check every month. Not much, just enough to cover my medication and some extras. Jenna said she'd handle the budgeting. I never saw the bank statements again. I asked once, gently, quietly, about seeing the account. She smiled, but her eyes didn't. "Mom, do you think I'd steal from you?" she said. I felt ashamed even asking. I never asked again. Sometimes when they had company, she'd suggest I rest in my room. I'd hear the clink of glasses, bursts of laughter. My door would stay shut. I stopped peeking out. I started pretending I was asleep. The walls, once so warm, started to feel like witnesses to something unspoken. I wasn't sure when it shifted from caregiving to caretaking, from love to obligation, from daughter to landlord. Even my garden grew wild. She said it was too much upkeep. Harold's roses withered in silence. Still, I stayed. Until that Thanksgiving tray, cold turkey, plastic fork, no seat at the table. That's when something inside me, something I thought had long quieted, whispered again. Not bitterness, not revenge, just a single truth. I'm still here, and I'm still mine. After Thanksgiving, something shifted in me. Not all at once. No, it was gentler than that. Like the way autumn creeps into the trees before you even notice the leaves have changed. I stopped trying so hard. Stopped asking to be included. Stopped waiting for my name to be spoken with warmth. But that didn't stop the little humiliations from coming. They arrived quietly, like ants in the sugar bowl. One morning, I noticed my hearing aids were gone from my nightstand. I searched every drawer, even checked under my pillow. When I asked Jenna, she waved her hand and said, "I tucked them away so you don't misplace them again." I hadn't misplaced them before, but I nodded. I always nodded. From that day on, I missed half of what they said. Maybe that was the point. Another time, a woman from church, Marion, who used to bring me fresh rolls every Thursday, rang the bell. I was sitting in the living room, Bible in my lap. Jenna peeked through the curtain and whispered, "Not today, Mom. You're tired." She opened the door just enough to tell Marion I was resting, then shut it softly. I sat there, my hands folded over my Bible, like a child waiting for permission to speak. They say aging feels like losing pieces of yourself slowly, but I don't think that's true. Aging feels more like being erased while still being alive to notice it. I remember trying to make tea one evening. I stood at the stove, my fingers trembling more than usual, and she appeared behind me. "Mom, it's just easier if I do it," she said. She took the kettle from my hand like I was holding something dangerous. I watched her fill it, heat it, pour it, all in silence, while I stood like a ghost beside my own sink. Sometimes I caught Madison staring at me, not with anger, just indifference, like I was a task her mother hadn't yet finished. She no longer called me Nana, just her, when she spoke about me at all. Is she coming to the recital? Did she eat already? They began talking around me, not to me. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Laughter paused, then resumed when I left. I started counting how often I was spoken to each day. Some days, it was once. "Here's your pill." Other days, not at all. One afternoon, I reached for the phone to call my sister's boy, Daniel. We used to be close, but the phone line was dead. I checked the plug. It was still in. When I asked, Jenna said they switched to mobile only, and she'd forgotten to mention it. She promised to show me how to use a smartphone, but the lesson never came. Even the house began to forget me. She repainted the living room, a cool gray that felt like waiting rooms and winter clouds. My wedding photo didn't return to the wall. When I asked about it, she said, "We're keeping things minimal now." Minimal. That word echoed inside me like an empty hallway. I still tried, in little ways. I folded Madison's laundry once, the soft cotton shirts, the socks with cartoon frogs. Jenna found me in her room, quietly smoothing a blouse on the bed. She sighed. "Mom, you don't need to do this. Just rest, okay?" Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were elsewhere. It wasn't the words. It was the way they made me feel unnecessary. I began to keep to my room more. I wrote small notes to myself in the margins of my Bible. Things like, "You are still loved," and "God sees even in silence." It helped a little, not because I believed them all the time, but because they were mine. Then came the doctor's appointment. I'd asked Jenna to schedule one. I was having trouble sleeping, my joints aching more than usual. She said she'd handle it. A few weeks passed. Nothing. When I brought it up again, she said, I talked to them already. They said unless it's an emergency, they won't see you until January. The system's backed up. I accepted it. Until I found a letter in the trash, unopened, with my doctor's name on the envelope. My hands trembled as I pulled it out. My appointment had been scheduled 2 weeks prior. Missed. I held that envelope like it was a verdict. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house. I wasn't sure if I was more hurt or more tired. I started to wonder if this was it, if my days would now be measured in pills and silence, if I was waiting, not for death, but for acknowledgement. I remembered the way Harold used to touch my hand across the dinner table, no words, just presence. The way Jenna, as a little girl, would cry if I wasn't home when she came back from school. That small girl, once so full of need and trust, where had she gone? One morning, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. My reflection startled me. My eyes looked dimmer, my shoulders curved. I didn't look old. I looked unfinished, like a painting someone gave up on. That's when I realized this wasn't about age. It wasn't about needing help. It was about not being wanted. And that kind of loneliness, it doesn't whisper. It roars, inside the chest, quietly, so no one else can hear it. The sun was already down when Jenna knocked on my door. She didn't wait for me to answer, just opened it halfway and placed a plastic bag on the dresser. Your prescriptions, she said without looking up. I handled the copay. You can thank me later. Then she was gone. The bag sat there like an accusation. I reached for it slowly, my fingers brushing the thin paper slip inside. My name was still printed in bold, Margaret E. Winslow. But even that felt like a name I no longer belonged to. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at my hands. The veins stood like soft rivers beneath thin skin, each line tracing a life of doing. I once braided Jenna's hair every morning before school. I once mended her prom dress the night before, when she spilled grape soda on it. These hands had known love. They had been useful. Now, they were just tired. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe an hour, maybe more. In the hallway, I heard music, Madison's favorite song, something electronic, thumping, the laughter of a child I once cradled in my arms. My granddaughter. A voice that once called me Nana, like it meant safety. I couldn't remember the last time she sat with me, or asked me anything about my life. It was strange how being alive could feel so much like being buried. I rose slowly and walked toward the living room, my slippers catching against the hallway rug. The walls were decorated now, with framed quotes, things Jenna printed off the internet. Good vibes only, one said, in cursive. Another. Family is everything. I paused in front of that one. Family is everything. I kept walking. They didn't notice me. Jenna was on her phone, legs curled on the sofa. Madison beside her, eyes on the television. A cooking show flickered, showing roasted garlic and melted cheese. The smell of takeout clung to the air, something rich and spicy I hadn't tasted in years. I stood there, in my own house, and no one turned. Finally, Jenna glanced up. Her voice was flat. Do you need something? I opened my mouth, closed it again. Madison didn't look away from the screen. No, I said after a moment. Nothing? I turned back toward my room. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beneath the same quilt Harold and I had shared. The pattern faded from years of washing, soft like old memories. I pressed my hand to the empty side of the bed. Once, he'd reach for me in the dark, his fingers brushing mine, even in dreams. I miss you, I whispered aloud. It felt foolish, but it was true. I turned toward the window. The moon hung low, casting silver shadows on the carpet, and I thought about that word, burden. It echoed louder than any insult could have. A burden. That's what I had become. Not a mother, not a woman with a life, or stories, or tenderness to offer. Just a weight. And what do people do with burdens? They put them away, out of sight, out of mind. The realization didn't come like a slap. It came like cold water running through me, slow, unstoppable. I wasn't being cared for. I was being managed. I thought of the way Jenna spoke to me now, always in tasks. Take your pills, move over, go lie down, like I was a thing she needed to handle. I thought of how she laughed with Madison in the next room, and how that laughter never reached me. And I thought of that Thanksgiving plate, the food cold, the tray flimsy. I had always made holidays feel like something holy. Now, I was just something to feed and forget. That's when I felt it, the breaking. It didn't come with tears, it came with stillness. The kind of stillness that means something inside you has shifted so far off center, it may never return. And for the first time, I allowed myself to ask the question I had swallowed for months. Why am I still here? Not in the way that asks about living, but in the way that asks, what am I holding on for? There was no room left for excuses, no tender explanations for Jenna's behavior, no illusions about family ties. Blood alone doesn't keep a heart warm. I had given her everything: time, love, a home, my patience. And all I had left was silence. I looked toward the closet. Inside, I knew, was a box, a small wooden one with papers Harold had once told me to keep safe. The deed, the will, a list of contacts. I had forgotten it was even there. I rose, walked to the closet, and knelt slowly. My knees groaned beneath me, but I didn't stop. I pulled the box out, blew the dust away. Inside, tucked beneath old tax papers, was the original deed to the house, my name and Harold's side by side. A pang ran through me, not anger, but grief. Grief that what was once built on love had become something else, something I didn't recognize. And then I knew. This wasn't my home anymore. The walls had been painted, the pictures removed, the voices colder. But more than that, my place in it was gone. They didn't need me, and I could no longer pretend I belonged. I sat back, the box in my lap, and felt the quietest kind of peace wash over me. Not because I had found the answer, but because I had finally stopped running from the question, who am I now when they no longer see me? The box sat beside me on the bed for 3 days. I didn't open it again, not yet. Just knowing it was there, knowing that something still held my name, that something remembered me as I was, that was enough to make me sit a little straighter. It felt like a lifeline, like the last lamp burning in a long, dark hallway. On the 4th morning, I dressed before sunrise. A soft gray cardigan, slacks that still fit. I tied my shoes myself. My fingers fumbled with the laces, but I did not call for help. I made a cup of tea, the same kind I used to make for Harold. 1 spoon of honey. Not because I liked it sweet, but because that's how he took it, and somehow it became how I did too. I sat by the kitchen window, the sky still purple, and watched the light arrive. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a guest in my own day. Later that morning, I found a piece of paper in my drawer, yellowed, slightly wrinkled, from an old church bulletin. It had a quote I'd copied years ago. God doesn't always part the sea. Sometimes he hands you the paddle. I stared at those words until they settled into my chest. Then I stood up, walked to the closet, and opened the box again. I didn't rush. I smoothed each paper with my palms like I was ironing the past back into shape. There it was, the deed, with Harold's signature still bold, mine beside it. Our names were once enough to make a life, and I realized, with a slow breath, that just because he was gone didn't mean I had to be erased too. There was a list tucked in the back, contacts Harold had written in small, neat handwriting. Our old attorney, the bank manager we trusted. I hadn't looked at it since he died. But now, I traced my finger over each name like I was reading scripture. I folded the papers carefully, slid them into a fresh envelope, and put on my coat. Jenna asked where I was going. I told her gently, just to town. She didn't look up from her laptop. Don't forget your phone." I didn't reply. I stepped out into the cool air and walked to the bus stop down the street. The ride into town was slow, winding through neighborhoods that had changed while I wasn't looking. Stores had new names, trees had grown taller, but something inside me felt still, solid. I got off near Main Street, just past the pharmacy and the diner Harold and I used to love. The courthouse sat quietly at the corner, the same chipped stone steps I remembered. Inside, I waited in line. When it was my turn, I asked the clerk for help updating my will. She looked up, blinked, then smiled softly. "Of course, ma'am. Let's get you started." There was no anger in me, no vengeance, only clarity. I wasn't doing this to punish anyone. I was doing this to reclaim the name they had stopped using with respect. I was still Margaret, still a mother, still a woman who built a home from borrowed money and tenacity, and I would not leave this world as a shadow. The clerk connected me with someone in their elder services department, a small office, a woman with kind eyes and steady hands. She explained the process. She listened without interruption. I told her what I wanted, to leave what little I had to people who still saw me, or to causes that might carry my name with care. Not to Jenna, not anymore. I didn't cry. I felt calm, like I'd finally exhaled after years of holding my breath. The woman said I could return next week to sign the formal version. She slid a temporary draft across the desk. I signed it. When I stepped back outside, the sun was high, warm against my face. I stood there a moment, letting the light touch me, letting the breeze lift the corners of my cardigan. I wasn't anyone's burden, not today, not anymore. That night, I didn't speak much at dinner. They'd brought home takeout again. Madison scrolled her phone. Jenna mentioned something about a broken garbage disposal. I nodded politely. After dinner, I returned to my room. I opened my Bible and placed the draft of my new will inside it, just under Psalm 71, the one that begins, "Do not cast me away when I am old." I pressed my hand to the page. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't angry. I was simply done, waiting to be treated like someone who mattered. That kind of treatment, I realized, begins with how I treat myself. And I had begun to remember who I was. The one who taught Jenna how to tie her shoes. The one who waited up for Harold through every night shift. The one who planted rose bushes with hope, even in hard soil. The one who could still choose, even if quietly, how her story ended. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Let me know in the comments. The morning I returned to the courthouse, the skies hung heavy with clouds, not stormy, just still, gray, and quiet. A fitting kind of weather for the work I was doing. Nothing dramatic, just the steady, deliberate reclaiming of what had been quietly taken. I carried my purse in both hands. Inside it, nestled between a tissue packet and a butterscotch candy, was the updated draft of my will. The same kind woman from last week greeted me again. Her name was Susan. She wore her hair in a loose bun and smelled faintly of jasmine. There was a gentleness in the way she handed me a pen, the way she said, "Take your time." And I did. Each signature, each initial, I treated them like prayers. Tiny declarations that I still had a say, that I wasn't just being moved along in someone else's story. When it was done, she folded the paper carefully, stamped it, and slid a notarized copy into a folder. "There you go, Mrs. Winslow," she said, with the kind of smile that touches the eyes. "You've made your wishes known." And just like that, it was real, not loud, not angry, just final. I stepped outside, the wind brushing my face like a soft cloth. I felt taller than I had in years. Lighter, too, not because the burden was gone, but because I had placed it down, myself, where I chose. On the way home, I stopped at the small bakery near the bus stop. They still sold the almond cookies Harold loved. I bought one, just one, and wrapped it carefully in a napkin. I placed it in my purse beside the will. I didn't know why. Maybe just to remind myself that even sweetness can fit into small spaces. That night, while Jenna and Madison watched a movie, I sat in my room with the door half closed. I opened the folder, read the words again slowly. I had named the community center as the primary beneficiary, the one downtown that offered meals, reading programs, and warmth for people like me. The rest, a small sum from the life insurance policy, some old jewelry, my wedding band, would go to Daniel, my sister's son. The only one who still called on holidays, who still asked how I was really doing. For Jenna, I left a letter. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't even bitter. Just a few pages, written in my oldest cursive, on linen paper I found in the back of the closet. I wrote, "I loved you more than breath. I hope you'll understand why I had to choose peace over presents, and why I'm giving this house, the one your father built with love, to a place that will carry his kindness forward." I didn't sign it Mom, just Margaret, because the woman who raised her, she was saying goodbye now. Over the next few days, I began to sort things gently. I packed a small suitcase, just enough for 3 outfits, my Bible, the photo of Harold from our wedding day, and the quilt I'd stitched with my own hands. The rest, I let be. This wasn't running away. This was walking forward. I had spoken with Mavis at church, an old friend who lived in a modest 2-bedroom house not far from town. When I asked her cautiously if she knew of anyone who rented a room, she took my hand and said, "I've got a room, and you've got a story. Let's sit in both." The way she said it, like I wasn't a charity case, but a companion, made my throat ache. We made a plan. Quiet, simple. Next Tuesday, after Jenna left for work, Mavis would come with her son's pickup. No speeches, no goodbyes, just a quiet shift in the tide. The night before, I walked through the house slowly. I touched the doorknobs, ran my fingers across the hallway walls. The grooves from Madison's height marks were still there, faint but present. I didn't erase them. Some marks are meant to remain, not to be removed, just to be outgrown. I paused in the kitchen, where I once taught Jenna how to make cornbread. I remembered her little face, flour-dusted and bright. She'd clapped when it rose in the oven. That child, the one who reached for me with trust, she wasn't here anymore. But I blessed her memory anyway. The next morning, I rose early, made tea one last time. When Mavis arrived, she didn't honk. She just waited at the curb, her eyes soft, the way a person waits when they know you're walking away from something that once meant the world. I left the letter on the kitchen table, weighted down by a small porcelain bird Jenna once gave me when she was 10. "You remind me of her," she'd said then. "You always come back." But I wasn't coming back, not to be cruel, just because I didn't need to anymore. The truck engine hummed quietly as we pulled away. I didn't look back. I held my Bible in my lap, the quilt folded beside me. And as the house faded behind us, I felt it. Not regret, not guilt. Just peace. The kind that comes when you finally stop asking to be seen and start walking where the light finds you again. It was the scent that brought it back, the smell of lemon soap on Mavis's dish towel. I was drying my teacup in her small kitchen, my hand slow and steady when I caught it. That soft, citrus smell. My breath caught before I even understood why. And just like that, I was 35 again, back in my mother's kitchen, smaller, worn down, with linoleum that always peeled in the corners no matter how much she scrubbed. She'd used lemon soap too, only brand she trusted. Said it was the smell of a woman doing right. But what I remember most about that day wasn't the smell. It was the silence. It was the day I learned that silence can be sharper than any blade. I had just come home from the doctor's office. Harold was working late. Jenna was in kindergarten. I remember the way my hands trembled as I pulled into the gravel driveway. I was still in my blue dress, the one I wore for errands. My purse held the letter. A letter that said something no woman wants to hear. "We're sorry, but the baby no longer has a heartbeat." We had been trying for a 3rd child, and I had felt every flutter, every change. But something had gone quiet inside me, and stayed quiet. I went to my mother's that afternoon. I don't know why. Maybe I thought she'd hold me, or tell me it wasn't my fault, or just say something kind. But when I told her, standing by that chipped countertop, she didn't look up from the dishes. She just said, "Well, at least you've got two already." That was it. No arms around me, no sorrow, just the clink of plates and the running water. I stood there, a hollow woman holding a letter, and realized how easy it was for someone to ignore your pain when they found it inconvenient. I never spoke of that baby again, not to Harold, not even to myself. I buried the grief in places people wouldn't look, under birthday cakes, school plays, family dinners. I wrapped it in service. I poured it into Jenna's lunchboxes and bedtime stories. And over time, I told myself it didn't matter anymore. But that day in my mother's kitchen, that absence of comfort, it left a scar, a quiet one. The kind that doesn't bleed, the kind that makes you swallow pain for years until your throat forgets how to speak it. I learned something then, that not all betrayal is loud. Sometimes it's simply the choice not to see you. And that kind, it cuts deepest, because it teaches you to question your right to hurt. That's what I carried into motherhood. That's what shaped how I raised Jenna, always present, always gentle, always giving. I swore I'd never let her feel what I felt in that moment, never let her wonder if her sadness was too inconvenient to be acknowledged, but maybe I gave so much of myself that she never learned what I looked like as a person, only as a provider. I don't excuse her cruelty, but I do understand now how long I've been silencing myself, how I made my whole life about protecting others from discomfort, even when it meant erasing my own needs. And when the erasing becomes habit, people forget you were ever fully there to begin with. I sat with that memory for a long time in Mavis's kitchen, the lemon scent still lingering, the warmth of her little house wrapping around me like a shawl. She didn't ask what I was thinking, just placed a soft hand on mine and said, "There's soup on the stove, when you're ready." And that small gesture, simple, without expectation, undid something in me. Later, in the room she'd given me, I opened a small notebook and wrote, "You are not too much. Your pain is not too loud. You are allowed to be seen." I underlined the last part twice. That night, I lit a small candle beside the bed, watched its flicker dance against the wall, and I whispered softly to the child I lost, "I remember you. I always did." Then to myself, "And I remember me now too." The letter came on a Wednesday, a plain white envelope, no return address, just my name written in that stiff, printed font that always makes me uneasy. It was forwarded by the post office. Mavis had helped set that up when I moved in. I thanked her again as she handed it to me. She didn't ask what it was. I think she saw something in my face, the way I held it, the way my fingers went still, and knew to give me space. I waited until I was alone. Waited until the light had softened into that late afternoon gold that always made Harold say, "This is the light God uses for his favorite work." I sat on the bed, opened the letter. The first page was from the county recorder's office. The second was the copy of a deed. My eyes moved slowly over the words, each line pressing heavier than the last. Owner of record, Jenna Winslow. Transfer date, October 8th. Filed, October 10th. I blinked. October 10th. That was 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. 3 weeks before she set my dinner on a tray. 3 weeks before she called me a burden. And long after she had removed me from the one thing Harold and I built with our bare hands. My name was no longer on the deed. No co-owner, no survivorship clause, just hers. There was a small note at the bottom. Transfer executed via quitclaim deed. That word, quitclaim, made my stomach turn. It meant someone had signed away their interest willingly. But I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. I would have remembered that. My hands shook too much for signing anything without effort, and nothing of that sort had crossed my eyes. Unless she'd signed it for me. I sat there for a long while, the papers trembling in my hands. Not crying. Just unraveling. Because this wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. She hadn't just ignored me. She had taken what was mine, our home, and written me out of it. Quietly, legally, without my knowing. I thought back to the day my hearing aids went missing. The bank statements I no longer saw. The way she handled the paperwork. How I'd stopped asking questions because it seemed easier to be compliant. But compliance? That was the trap. Because silence makes it easy for people to reshape your reality. And I had given her the silence she needed. I walked to the small mirror above the dresser. Looked at my face. My hair was thinner now, my jaw softer. But the eyes looking back at me, they were sharp, alert, awake, and angry. Not wild, furious anger. Not the kind that breaks plates or throws curses. This was different. This was grief that had calcified into something stronger. She had taken my name off the deed, but she had not taken me. She had taken my home, but not my voice. I returned to the bed, laid the pages flat, and I remembered a conversation I'd had with Harold once, on the back porch. The sun had been setting behind his shoulder, and he'd said, "People don't always change. Sometimes they just get more comfortable showing you who they always were." I had refused to see it in Jenna. I saw her stress, her exhaustion, her loneliness after the divorce, but I didn't see the way she had slowly shifted from daughter to owner. The warmth that used to live between us had become a transaction, and I had been too willing to believe it was love. That night, I couldn't sleep. The papers sat on the nightstand like a final sermon, and the truth whispered to me over and over. She wrote me out before I even said goodbye. She took what was mine before I even had the words to ask for it back. I didn't tell Mavis, not yet. I needed to carry it alone for a little while, to feel its weight, to decide what I would do with it. But deep down, I knew there was no going back now. Jenna had made her choice, and I would make mine. In the silence of that small room, with the night pressing in soft around me, I folded the deed back into its envelope, sealed it, and placed it inside the drawer beside my Bible. Then I turned out the light and whispered to the darkness, "I see you now." And with that simple truth, the wound stopped bleeding. It didn't heal, but it stopped pretending it wasn't there. The next morning, I didn't cry. There were no angry letters, no late-night phone calls, no trembling hands dialing Jenna's number to demand answers. Just a quiet steadiness, like the way frost forms on a window pane. Silently, beautifully, and without asking permission. I made myself oatmeal and ate it at the table with a linen napkin in my lap. No television, no noise, just the sound of the spoon against the bowl and the soft hum of the refrigerator. I didn't rush. I let myself take up space. I was done asking to be seen. That was the shift. It didn't come with a bang or some grand declaration. It came with the decision not to go backward. I didn't need confrontation. I didn't need apologies. I didn't even need her to admit what she'd done. I simply chose to stop explaining my worth. Mavis noticed. Not right away, but after a few days, she began watching me differently. One afternoon, she placed a folded cardigan on the edge of my bed and said, "There's something lighter in you," and she was right. I had laid something down, not the pain. That was still there, and maybe always would be. But the need to be understood, I'd set that aside. In the following days, I began making small changes. I canceled the joint bank account I'd shared with Jenna. Quietly, without announcement. The teller at the bank, a young woman with gentle eyes, simply nodded and said, "Good for you." I called the doctor's office, updated my contact information, scheduled an overdue checkup. I changed the emergency contact on file. Little by little, I pulled myself out of the web Jenna had woven, not with anger, but with careful precision. Every quiet step felt like reclaiming a name I hadn't spoken in years. Margaret. Not Mom, not Nana, just Margaret. I found myself writing that name again, in the margins of books, on grocery lists, in the top corner of a crossword puzzle. And every time I wrote it, I felt steadier. There was power in taking up space again, even if it was only in ink. One afternoon, I went to the community center downtown, the one I'd named in my will. I asked if they needed volunteers for their reading program. The woman behind the desk smiled. "Always," she said, "especially with the little ones." I spent that afternoon reading picture books aloud to second graders, their faces round with joy, their questions spilling out like birds. One little girl asked, "Are you somebody's grandma?" I paused, smiled gently. "I used to be," I said. "Now I'm just someone who likes stories." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. And maybe it did. Maybe that was enough. That evening, back in my room, I sat with my tea and watched the sky darken through the window. The world was still turning, slowly, softly, without needing to explain itself. And I realized I didn't have to explain myself either. I no longer reached for the phone. I no longer checked for messages. Jenna hadn't called. I wasn't sure if she even noticed I'd removed myself from her name, her control, her narrative. But I no longer lived inside her silence. I had my own now. And in that silence, I planted things. Routine, peace, self-respect. Things she couldn't take because they didn't live in deeds or papers. They lived in how I folded my clothes, how I spoke to myself in the mirror, how I chose not to chase validation anymore. I donated half my clothes, the ones I no longer wore, the ones that still smelled like the house I'd left. I kept only what felt like mine. Simple sweaters, long skirts, my gardening apron. Things that felt honest. I wrote postcards to old friends, not with updates, but with blessings. "Thinking of you," I wrote to one, "still here," to another, "I hope your daffodils bloom extra bright this spring." I didn't ask for replies. I just sent the words out like seeds. And I think that's what healing became for me. Not something loud or visible, but something done in quiet, with dignity. Like lighting a candle when no one's watching, simply because you still believe in light. I no longer needed to win anything. I had already won. Because I had stopped shrinking, stopped apologizing for existing, stopped begging to be remembered by someone who had already forgotten the sound of my laughter. And instead, I remembered it myself. I began humming again while I folded laundry. Soft old hymns my mother used to sing before she forgot how to love gently. I began wearing perfume again. Not much, just a dab of lavender at my wrists. It wasn't for anyone, just for me. I started praying again, not with desperation, but with gratitude. Thank you for the quiet. Thank you for the stillness. Thank you for the wisdom that finally came. The day I found the letter was the day I realized I wasn't walking alone. It had slipped inside one of my old cookbooks, Margaret's Holiday Favorites. I hadn't opened it in years. The cover was cracked and worn at the edges, pages stained with cinnamon and thyme. I'd been looking for a muffin recipe to share at the community center when the envelope fell from between two pages. Yellowed, untouched. The handwriting on the front was Harold's. My hands trembled as I opened it. It wasn't long. Just a single sheet of notebook paper, folded twice. He must have tucked it there years ago, probably around the holidays, probably thinking I'd find it sooner. But somehow, it waited for the right moment. I sat down on the edge of the bed, unfolded it carefully. At the top, in his simple, blocky script, he had written, "For when you forget how strong you are." And then, "If the day ever comes when you feel like you've disappeared, like no one sees you, I want you to read this. You made a home from scratch. You made our kids feel safe even when money was thin and the roof leaked. You made holidays out of leftovers and hope. You held me through grief, through joy, through all of it. You are not small. You are the center. Never let the world make you feel otherwise." I read it 3 times. Then I held it to my chest and let the tears come. Not the kind that scream or shake. Just slow, steady ones, like rain after a long drought. He had seen me, even then, even now. That letter became my spine. Every time I faltered, I read it again. Every time I questioned my choice to leave, to reclaim, to stop explaining, I ran my fingers over his words like rosary beads. And I wasn't alone in the world. I had Harold's voice on paper, and I had Mavis's hands in the real world. One afternoon, she sat beside me on the porch. We shared slices of apple pie I had baked, steam rising gently from our plates. She said, "You've been quieter lately, but not in a sad way." I nodded. "I think," I said slowly, "I stopped asking to be rescued, and I started rescuing myself." She smiled. That's the kind of quiet that saves women. Later that week, she invited me to her church group, a gathering of older women who knit, read aloud, and share stories over coffee. They welcomed me like I'd always belonged. No one asked about Jenna. No one asked what I had left behind. They only asked what I was reading, what colors I liked to knit, what I thought about the new scones from Margaret Ann's bakery. It was the first time in a long while that I was known simply as myself, not as a role, not as a duty, not as a burden, just Margaret. That became my safe place, those Thursday mornings. The letter folded in my wallet, the light in Mavis's kitchen, the children at the community center who called me Miss M and fought to sit closest during story time. Every one of them reminded me I was not invisible. I had simply been looking for light in the wrong rooms. Now I was standing in rooms that saw me fully. Rooms where my voice wasn't too quiet, my needs not too much. One evening, I stood in front of the mirror and practiced saying something I hadn't said in years. "I'm proud of you." I said it to my reflection, and I meant it. Because I had not let bitterness eat me alive. Because I had not waited for an apology to start healing. Because I had left with grace, written my will with clarity, chosen dignity over guilt. And because I had stayed soft, even after everything. In a world that had tried to harden me, I stayed soft, and that softness had become my greatest strength. Have you ever found strength in moments of silence? Let me know. The first message came in the form of a voicemail. I hadn't recognized the number. I rarely answered unknown calls anymore. But something told me to listen. It was Jenna. Her voice was sharper than I remembered, like it had been rubbed raw by panic. "Mom, I, I just realized your name's not on the account anymore. The bank said you changed things, and I got something from the attorney's office. Can you call me back?" She didn't say, "Are you okay?" She didn't say, "I miss you." Just confusion, a hint of worry, maybe fear. I didn't call her back. That wasn't cruelty. That was boundary. The next message came 2 days later. I don't understand why you did this. You could have talked to me. I mean, I thought we had an understanding." The word understanding echoed in my ears like something sour. What she had was control. What I gave her, for years, was trust. Now she didn't understand the absence of it. That week, Madison showed up at the community center. I was reading a book about turtles to the children when I saw her through the glass doors, shifting from foot to foot, arms crossed tight across her chest. Older now, 17, maybe 18. She waited until I was finished, then walked slowly toward me. "Nana?" Her voice cracked a little. I hadn't heard that word in months, maybe longer. I stood still. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, just less certain, like a child who wandered too far from something soft. She said, "I didn't know you left because of me." I shook my head. "I didn't." She looked down. "But I was awful to you." I didn't argue. I didn't soften the truth. I just let the silence be what it needed to be. Sometimes, letting someone feel the weight of their actions is the kindest thing you can do. She pulled something from her pocket, a small photo, one I hadn't seen in years. Me holding her at the zoo, both of us smiling wide. her chubby hands on my cheeks. "I found this in a drawer," she said. I didn't want you to think I forgot." I took the photo. My fingers brushed the corner where it had worn thin. "I never thought you forgot," I said quietly. "I just think you weren't being reminded." She nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I smiled gently. "Thank you." That was all. No lecture, no list of hurts. Just one quiet exchange, and then she left, and I let her. Because that's what healing looks like sometimes. Not reunion, just recognition. Later that week, Mavis told me Jenna had been calling around. The attorney's office, the church, even the senior center. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when someone began asking the wrong questions too loudly. She'd been surprised, apparently, to learn that the house could legally remain hers, but the rest wasn't. The will had been filed, the donations set, the accounts changed, the silence protected. And for the first time, Jenna had to sit with a version of her life where she didn't get to edit me out. I don't know what she felt. Regret, embarrassment, maybe just inconvenience. But I knew this. The woman who once used my name like an obligation now couldn't use it at all. She had removed me from her table. I had removed her from my legacy. And I didn't need her to understand that, only to feel it. Actions don't echo right away, but they always come home eventually. And now, she sat in a house full of things I once polished, memories I once created, surrounded by walls I once made sacred, and none of it could be bought back with guilt. Some losses stay lost. That's not revenge. That's the price of dismissal. I never felt joy from her confusion, only closure. A final line drawn in quiet ink. One afternoon, I received a letter, handwritten, short, from Jenna. It said, "I wish I had known what you needed. I thought I was doing enough. I guess I was wrong. I hope you're okay." There was no return address. I folded it, tucked it behind Harold's letter. Not as a keepsake, just as a reminder. Some people only see your value when they can't reach you anymore. But by then, your peace doesn't need their recognition. It stands on its own. It happened in the canned goods aisle. I hadn't planned it, wouldn't have chosen it. But fate doesn't ask for permission, does it? I was reaching for a can of peaches, the kind Harold liked, packed in syrup, not juice, when I heard a voice behind me. "Mom?" I froze. The voice wasn't angry or soft, just uncertain. I turned slowly. There she was, Jenna, standing beside her shopping cart, eyes wide, hair pulled back like she'd just run errands and wasn't expecting to run into a ghost. For a moment, we both just stood there. The years stretched long between us, but the silence felt louder. "I didn't think I'd see you here," she said, her voice low. I nodded. "I live nearby now." She looked down at her cart. Cans, bread, a frozen lasagna, then back up at me. "I've been trying to call." I nodded again, slowly. "I know." She bit her lip. "You didn't answer." "No," I said. "I didn't." She swallowed hard. I don't get why you did all that. Changing the will, giving the house away, leaving like that. You didn't even say goodbye." I placed the peaches in my basket, adjusted the strap of my purse. Then I looked her in the eyes, not with anger, but with something firmer, something she hadn't seen in me for a long time. "I did say goodbye," I said quietly, "just not with words you were willing to hear." She blinked. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said quickly. "I was just trying to manage everything. You know how hard it was. The divorce, Madison's school, the bills." I held up my hand. "No, Jenna. You were trying to manage me." Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. "I was never a bill to be paid," I continued. "Never a project. Never something to tuck away when company came over. I didn't mean it like that." But that's what it became. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They sat in the air like truth, undeniable, still. She stared at me for a long time, then asked, almost in a whisper, "Why did you leave everything to strangers?" I shook my head gently. They weren't strangers. They were people who saw me, people who didn't need me to shrink. Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. Maybe she'd run out. I thought I was doing enough, she said. I softened. You were doing what was easy, not what was loving. She looked at the floor. And I forgave her. Not out loud, not with some grand statement. But in the space between us, in the silence where anger might have lived, I felt something release. I didn't need her sorrow. I didn't need her change. I had already chosen peace without her participation. I stepped past her gently, the wheel of my basket squeaking faintly. She turned as I passed. Do you hate me? I paused, looked back at her, not as the daughter I'd raised, but as the woman she had become. No, I said, but I don't belong to you anymore. And with that, I walked away. Not with pride, not with triumph, just with grace. Because sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is walk through the same aisle where she was once overlooked, and not shrink. That was my final word. Not a scream, not a confrontation, just a boundary, set like stone, set like dignity, set like a name I still carried proudly. Margaret. I've always believed peace doesn't come with a trumpet. It comes like fog, slow, soft, almost unnoticed, until one morning you look around and realize the sharp edges are gone. That's how it felt now. It had been 3 months since I'd seen Jenna in that grocery aisle. Since then, the phone had stayed quiet. No new messages, no letters, and I was all right with that. I had not cut ties to punish her. I had simply loosened the rope from my own neck. My days found rhythm again, simple and whole. Each morning, I woke before the sun, wrapped myself in my robe, and sat by the window with my tea. I watched the light unfold across the rooftops like a slow promise. Mavis would join me when she woke, her footsteps soft on the hallway floor. We didn't always speak. Sometimes just the quiet company was enough. I volunteered twice a week at the community center now. Story time had become my favorite hour. The children would pile close, legs crossed, elbows bumping, voices filled with questions and delight. They called me Miss Margaret with such warmth it made my eyes sting. One little boy, Ezra, once told me, "You read like the words matter." I smiled, bent low, and whispered, "They do." I spent afternoons walking the neighborhood. I'd pass the bakery, wave to Mr. Jenkins at the flower stall, sometimes treat myself to a single chocolate croissant. I didn't rush anymore. There was nowhere I needed to be but here. I started keeping a journal again. Just a few lines each night. Things like, "Today the lilacs opened." Ezra guessed the ending before I read it. Smart boy. Harold would have loved Mavis's soup. It wasn't much, but it reminded me I was still making a life. I even began planting again. Mavis had a small patch of dirt near the fence. One Saturday morning, I knelt down with my trowel and began turning the soil. My knees creaked and my fingers ached, but I hummed as I worked. Lavender, rosemary, a few marigolds, nothing fancy, just roots. That's what I was doing, planting new roots, slow and deep. One afternoon, Daniel, my nephew, came to visit. He brought his daughter, Lily, all pigtails and questions. She ran through the house like it was her playground. Mavis laughed and let her. Daniel sat beside me on the porch, his voice low and kind. "I read the letter you sent," he said. "About the will, the house, everything." I nodded. He looked out toward the street. "I just want you to know, I'm honored, and I'll make sure your story doesn't get erased." That was all he said. But it was enough. For once, someone didn't ask me why. They just accepted my choice. I spent that evening in a kind of quiet joy, because finally, someone understood without needing to explain. I wasn't trying to rewrite history. I was just trying to write mine. Later that week, Mavis and I attended a small gathering at church. Nothing big, just a potluck and some old hymns on the piano. I brought my cornbread. The same recipe Jenna used to love. It was gone before the first verse finished. One woman patted my hand and said, "You've got a gift." And I believed her, because I'd stopped thinking that being unnoticed meant being unworthy. Now I knew better. I was not unseen. I had simply outgrown the places that refused to look. That night, I lay in bed with my window cracked open. The air smelled of fresh soil and rain, and I thought of everything that had happened. The cold tray on Thanksgiving, the erased deed, the words I'd swallowed for years. And I didn't feel broken anymore. I felt whole. Not because the pain disappeared, but because I finally stopped carrying it alone. I whispered into the dark, "You did it, Margaret. You made it back to yourself." And then, for the first time in a long while, I slept all the way through the night. People ask me now from time to time if I regret it, if I wish I'd stayed, if I miss them. And I tell them this: I miss what I hoped they'd become, but I don't miss how small I felt in their presence. I don't miss explaining my worth to people who only saw me as something to manage. I miss the sound of my granddaughter's laughter when she was 5, not the silence that followed when she forgot how to say my name with love. But regrets? No, because I chose peace. I chose my name. I chose not to be a lesson delivered through yelling or revenge, but through quiet absence. My story did not end in their kitchen. It did not end with a cold tray outside a locked door. It began again with a folded will, a letter from a husband who still knew my heart, and the strength to walk out without slamming a single door behind me. I do not hate them. I simply no longer bend toward places that cannot hold me gently. And if you, reading this, have ever felt forgotten, or small, or quietly erased, I hope you know this. You are not the burden. You are the builder, the dreamer, the memory keeper. You deserve warmth without asking, and silence that doesn't mean exile, but rest. And if no one else tells you tonight, you're still here. You still matter. You still get to write the ending. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten, remember, your worth doesn't depend on their understanding. Share your story in the comments. We're listening. We've always been listening, and you're not alone.